Yeah, I mean, I've referred to it as a scheme or a scam, and as she just said, it shouldn't have even been at the Supreme Court. This is an idea that the because the Constitution refers to the time, place, and manner of elections being determined by legislatures, that means that the legislature basically exists by itself out in the world, and it doesn't have to be exercising that authority within the constraints of its own state constitution. That you can't go to the state Supreme Court when the state legislature does something and say, look, this clearly violates our state constitution and they need to go back. Under this theory, you couldn't even do that.
You said something I want to pick up on, Chris, which is this shouldn't even be being argued at the Supreme Court. Then let's talk about how and why it's being argued.
Well, we got some information earlier in the year that it did look like Justices Thomas and Alito and Gorsuch were interested in hearing the case, and that Justice Kavanaugh was open to hearing the case. So under the Supreme Court's rules, it takes 4 justices to agree to hear a case. So that's where you would get the 4 votes to hear the case, and that's why they accepted it. The question of what they were going to do with it sort of is what led to, immediately after they granted it in June, a wide variety of voices from the left and the right saying, what are you doing? Why are you hearing this case?
Judith, you'll tell me if you disagree with me, but I think when you sort of look at broad efforts of tinkering with our democracy and voter suppression, something like SB 202 out of Georgia, I think a lot of people understand that, right? Especially in its like original form, where it's like people are just going to have less time to do all the things that they need to do. The windows are going to narrow. You remember at that point, you couldn't give water to people who were standing in line. People sort of viscerally understood that. And I sometimes worry with something like this case that it can seem really esoteric to people, right? That redistricting and gerrymandering, that it is not as tangible as where do I stand in line? Where do I send in my ballot? And yet, this is, as you said, a way to fundamentally shift power.
I mean, our government and our democracy relies upon checks and balances. And what this would do is that it would take away state courts as a check in the process around election laws. And we know that the state courts are really important. Now, North Carolina, they don't want it because there are a bunch of progressives on that state Supreme Court, right? But even think about this, Alicia, that in fact, what could also happen is that it would leave legislatures in power over election laws to undo things like Amendment 4 in Florida, right, which restored voting rights to people with felony convictions because the people wouldn't be able to decide about election laws, only the state legislature. And so we have to be really worried about the fact that our state legislatures would be have unfettered, unbridled power. And again, at the same time that they are striking down all of the voting protections at the federal level.
I wanted to say, Chris, that I'm sure Law Dork News audience was paying much more attention to this than even people who really care about this work. Can you talk us through sort of oral arguments from this past week? What was the top line?
Yeah, as I discussed at Law Dork, there was a sort of, for those people who were very nervous about this case, there was some reassuring moments in those arguments that the lawyer who was arguing for the independent state legislature scheme really faced a very hostile bench, pretty much almost entirely, with the exception of Justice Gorsuch. And so we did sort of come out of arguments with this idea that certainly the 3 Democratic appointees and to a certain extent, Justices Barrett and Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts have some very big concerns about the far reaches of this argument and how it could upend democracy.
Judith, I've only got about 30 seconds left, but I do want to ask you about the communities that are most impacted by something like this? I mean, it strikes me that North Carolina is a state that is changing demographically. That is not an accident.
That's right. All the southern states that are browning, right? We have more Black and brown people moving to the South who are becoming voters. They are the ones who are going to feel the brunt of this when these state legislatures decide to make sure that they restrict the vote so that brown and Black people cannot participate equally.